Hey, what's up, everybody? We are back today talking about putting together our monster deck as well as a strategy for playing the monster deck. I'll give you some my thoughts on the strategies on the deck, and as always, let me give you my caveat. This is not the only way to build a monster deck. It surely won't be the only way to play a monster deck, and the strategies I talk about, and the decisions I make, and the logic behind what I do when I build my deck is nothing that you have to do, need to do, must do in order to build, win, or use a monster deck. This is simply my thoughts on it. I had someone ask about the Northern Realms deck who missed some cards and said they wanted to know about the monster deck, about possibly using that, and I figured I'd just throw out a video instead of writing a long-winded reply to their question. So, here is a hopefully quick, but probably not, overview of the monster deck. Let's get into it, and we're going to check out the leaders in the monster deck. First things first, we are going to get rid of the cards that are in the deck right now, just so that we can kind of build this together and start from scratch. So, leaders in the monster deck. Leader number one here is got the ability to restore a card from your discard pile to your hand. I don't like this card. The reason I don't like this card is as a monster deck, when you play your cards, you're playing a lot around cards that have a muster ability. When you use a card that has the muster ability, it pulls cards from your deck and from your hand, not from your discard pile. So if you wind up playing a muster group on the board and they go into your discard pile, if you dip into your discard pile and pull out a muster card, it's not like it's going to re-pull the cards onto the board. It's not going to. It's just going to sit there and it's going to do nothing. It's just going to be a regular card that goes on the board and it doesn't do anything for you. So I don't like that. Um, this card is similar to a medic insofar as it will pull a card out of the discard pile, but instead of putting it on the board, it puts it in your hand, and it's identical to the medic insofar as it will pull a unit card out of your discard pile. It will not pull out a hero card, special card, etc., etc. The one thing you can use this to pull out is if you're playing a Northern Realms deck or you're playing against a Nilfgaard deck and you get spied up and you have absolutely no ability to respond to those spies with decoys, you can use this leader's ability to pull a spy out of your discard pile and play it back on them. The logic and theory and strategy all behind playing spies changes from Nilfgaard and Northern Realms to what you might do with a monster deck. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But that's about the only situation I see this card being useful for. That's a very specific situation, and it's just not something that there's other abilities I think are better as far as the leader cards go. So I really don't like this card. Next one, discard 2 cards and draw 1 card of your choice from your deck. Man, that sounds like a great ability. You get to draw a card, you get to get some cards out of your hand that you don't like. Oh, that's just great. And then you use it and you're like, oh shit, really, in theory that sounded good, but in practice this kind of sucks. The reason it kind of sucks is as a monster deck, you run really, really lean. So it's not like you have a bunch of spy cards that are enabling you to draw big numbers into your hand. So you're never sitting there with like 18 cards in your hand or 16 cards in your hand. You're constantly dwindling down the cards that you're holding in your hand with the monster deck. So when it says discard 2 cards and draw 1 card, it's likely that the 2 cards that you have, the 10 cards you have in your hand off the initial draw are all cards that you want to use. If they're not cards that you wanted to use and you would really rather discard them, one, you probably want to modify your deck build a little bit because that shouldn't come up too often. And two, if you're like, oh great, I hate those cards, I want to get these 2 cards out of my hand, I'm glad I had, this is why I used this leader, is so I can dump these. What the fuck are you doing? Just stop using those cards. Get them out of your deck. Put 2 cards in the deck that you want, or don't put any more cards in your deck, and don't use this leader card for that reason. I see people talk about that on the forums, like, oh, when I pull the cards out of my deck that I don't like, I can just discard them. Well, yeah, it's not like redrawing, which is what they think it is. Redrawing means it goes back into your deck when you choose not to use it. When you discard, this shit goes in your discard pile. There's no getting it out of there unless you have a medic. So, and since there's only one medic available for the Um, Monster deck. This card doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't. It's not. It's useful in very specific situations. So here's one where it becomes useful. If you are running the Mysterious Elf in your deck, okay, and you're running Yennefer, and you wind up in a situation where you draw Yennefer, you can take two cards, dump them in your discard pile, right? Draw one card out of your deck with this, being the one card you would want to draw out would be the Mysterious Elf, provided you hadn't already drawn it into your hand. And then you could play Yennefer and grab one of those cards out of your discard pile, and in so doing, after you play your Mysterious Elf, you have, in a roundabout way, shuffled around three cards. But that's about it. I mean, it's pretty... I just don't understand what the fascination with this card is. I've run with it, and I have really never been in a situation with any of my decks where I was like, damn, am I glad that I have this leader card. This really saved my ass. It's been more like, the hell was I thinking running this piece of shit? This isn't helping me at all. I'd rather have, X, Y, or Z, something else. Hell, shit, I'd almost rather have something like this. So, it just... not a card that I think is very useful. Maybe you do. Hey, use it. If you have a way of using this that makes you successful in the game, do it. I haven't seen anyone describe in the forums their love of this card and then come up with any reasoning that makes any sense whatsoever as to why this is good over the other leader cards in this deck. So I don't use it, don't like it. The next leader card that we're going to talk about is pick any weather card from your deck and play it instantly. This is an excellent ability on a leader card because, as a monster deck, you are rocking a ton of close combat cards that are under the muster nomiker. So if you go in and look at your monster deck, all the muster cards, save one, have a close combat badge on them. So when you go to play them out, they're all going in that close combat line. The reason this becomes useful is because in that close combat line, when you stack them all up there, you become vulnerable to Biting Frost. If Biting Frost gets dumped in your close combat line and you're really stacking it hard with a bunch of points, that can really screw you over. So if you have the ability to dip into your deck and yank out a clear weather card at any time, it is very, very useful. It also puts you in a position where if you were to carry 2 or 3 clear weather cards in your deck and you drew into one, you could always redraw it on the initial card pick where it gives you 2 cards you can redraw. You could always redraw it and be confident that if you didn't draw another one, if you got bad weather, like Biting Frost on your close combat line, you could always just use your leader's ability to get rid of it. So this is definitely one of, but not my complete favorite leaders in the monster deck. My favorite leader in the monster deck is this one. It says double the strength of all your close combat units. This is effectively a Commander's Horn on the close combat line at will. So anytime you need a Commander's Horn on the close combat line, you just punch this leader ability and boom, there it is. So it's a free Commander's Horn on the close combat line, which is the line where you're playing the majority of your cards from your monster deck. This lines up perfectly with the deck, and it is the leader that I run about 70% of the time. 7 out of 10 matches, I use this guy. About 3 out of 10 matches, I use this guy. These cards really just never make it into my hand for the reasons I said beforehand. So these both are great cards, and they both work really well. They have some excellent attributes to save you. This guy you're going to wind up using. You have the ability to use him all the time. He is situational, but you'd be surprised how many times that close combat line gets Biting Frost applied to it, and it can give you a very bad day unless you have certain cards in your hand that aren't clear weather. So there's a way to play around that, which I'll get to a little bit later. But once again, these are the 2 favorite leader cards in this deck that I have. Maybe you like different cards. Play your own way. Play your own way. Enjoy the game in a way that works for you, but this is just my opinion. I like these 2 cards most of all. So if we're going to stick with this guy as our default leader card, and we're going to jump into our monster cards and talk about what cards we're going to put in our deck. So we're going to back out of here so we can reshuffle these cards so that they line up a little bit better. There we go. Alright, so let's dump our muster cards into our deck. If you don't know what the muster ability is, we'll check it out here real quick. It says find any cards with the same name in your deck and play them instantly, which means if you have one ghoul in your hand and you have two ghouls in your deck, when you play this one ghoul, it's going to reach into your deck and it's going to play these two ghouls on the board as well. Same thing if you have two ghouls in your hand and one in your deck. When you play any of the two ghouls in your hand, it's going to play the other and go into your deck and get this one. So it's a great way to get a lot of cards onto the board very quickly. So we're going to throw these guys in our deck. 1, 2, 3. Then we're going to throw our neckers in our deck. 1, 2, 3. So this is the other muster group. There's 3 neckers. The next one is going to be the vampires. There are 5 vampires. You've got 4 4-point vampires and 1 5-point vampire. He is up here. I'm going to throw him in. The next group is the Arrakis muster group. There are 3 4-point cards, and there is a 6-point siege line card. So make note of the fact that this is not a close combat card. This card actually, when you pull it out, goes on the siege line. The next group is going to be our crones. It's my least favorite group, and I'll explain that to you in just a bit. But there are 3 of them. They each have a value of 6. So you can see they don't all have the same name, but they all have the same starting word or prefix, however you want to look at it. So crone weavis, crone wispis, crone brewis, Arrakis behemoth, vampire, etc., etc. You see what I'm getting at? So that's what makes a muster group. My personal opinion is early on in the game, these guys are fairly easy to come across. However, as you get later into the game and you pick up some additional cards, specifically hero cards, you're probably going to be dumping them out of your deck and not running them because they carry such a low point value and there are so many of them. So I'm going to dump them out of the deck here. I just wanted to show them to you to let you know they are available, they are out there, and you might run them early on when you're struggling to pick up cards. However, really to be successful with this deck, you really need to try to build out your higher point value musters as early as possible because that's what this deck kind of hinges on. As far as the musters themselves go, you can see the crones are worth 18 points. The Arrakis muster is also worth 18 points, and the vampire muster is worth 21 points. So the vampire muster is going to be your most beneficial muster to play from a point value perspective. 2 things to mention about the Arrakis muster and the vampire muster. The Arrakis muster and the vampire muster both are Scorch protected. They're not Scorch proof. So what does Scorch protected mean? If you look at the definition of a Scorch card, it says that it will scorch or kill off the highest point value card or cards on the board. So when you play these down, say your opponent has no cards on the board or every card on the board that they have is a 4 or lower, and you put these guys down, it's going to put 4 4-point cards and 1 5-point card. The nice thing about the 5-point card is if a Scorch comes out, the only thing that's going to touch is this 5-point card. This 5-point card is protecting all of your 4-point cards. So your group is not Scorch proof, it's just Scorch protected by this one card. So it makes it very nice. Same thing with the Arrakis. If you were to play this out on the board, it is this 6-point card that if a Scorch card comes out, it will protect these other cards from getting scorched. There is another type of Scorch that can come out. It is called a close combat Scorch, which is generated by a 7-point dragon card that looks like this. If we read its ability, it says destroy your enemy's strongest close combat units if the combined strength of all of his or her close combat units is 10 or more. What the hell does that mean? That means that when this card gets played, it's a Scorch, but it's not a typical Scorch. It's only going to apply if you have at least 10 points in value in your close combat line, and it is only going to address the highest point value cards in the close combat line. So what that means is if you were to play your Arrakis muster, you're going to play this in the close combat line, you're playing this in the close combat line, this in the close combat line, and then this goes in the siege line. So they all go out as a group, and now you have a 6 sitting in the siege line, and you have 3 4s sitting in the close combat line. If this goes out on the following turn after you play these guys, you're going to lose 1, 2, 3 cards because these are the highest point value cards that might be in that close combat line. Now, if you go up to the vampires, though, when these go out, since this 5-point card still lives in the close combat line, it protects the other ones from Scorch, from the close combat Scorch, just like it did from the regular Scorch. I'm hoping that makes sense. If you have questions, be sure to ask in the comments, and I'll be happy to go over it with you. But this is how you're protecting your guys from Scorch. The only other thing to mention is when you play cards in a certain order, I would recommend that you play the vampires first and then the Arrakis second. And the reason I say that is if this 5-point card is on the board, since it's in the close combat line, it is going to protect these cards when they go out if this dragon Scorch decides to come onto the board. Second thing is that if these guys are sitting on the board like they are, and then you play this set here, if the next card that comes out from your opponent is a Scorch, it's this card here that I have highlighted that's going to get scorched, not this 5-point Vampire Catechin. So he still remains to protect the rest of the 4-point cards that you have in that close combat line. So make sure that you go back, rewind the video, listen to that explanation again. That's very important that you understand how to play around Scorch the best you can. You can't avoid it, but you can attempt to play around it by strategically laying cards on the board in certain intervals, like I explained. The one thing that could give you a very bad day is if you load up your close combat line with all of your close combat cards, so your all of your musters, so your crones, your Arrakis, and your vampires. That's 5, 9, 10, 11, 12, right? So there's 12 cards there. If you put them all into the close combat line, and then a Biting Frost comes out, destroy your enemy's strongest close combat units if the combined strength of all of his close combat units is 10 or more. So if the Biting Frost goes out, every card that you put in that close combat line has now been taken from its original point value down to a 1. And since you put all 12 of them out there, there are 10 or more points on that line, and since they're all 1s, they're all the strongest close combat units on the line, which means if this comes out immediately following a Biting Frost on a line that looks like what I just described, you're going to lose every single one of those cards because they all have the exact same value, and it is the highest value in that close combat line. Even though it's a 1, it doesn't matter. It's still the highest value in that line. You can easily get all 12 cards wiped out on the board. So my recommendation, try to avoid at all costs playing all 3 groups at the same time unless you've already seen this guy come out. If you've already seen him come out, no big deal. The only problem you might have is if your opponent had absolutely no cards on the board in some weird, alignment of the fucking planets and stars set up a situation in which they had no cards but you had 12 cards on the board. Then you could fall victim to an actual Scorch. But outside of that, this is really, if this guy's off the board, he's already been played, you don't have to worry about it. But if he hasn't been played, just play your vampires and your Arrakis and let these guys go. Don't put them down and take that chance. Play them in another round. Play them in an earlier round. And the reason I mention that about these is not just to avoid stacking 12 cards in that line. It's that these 3 cards here, so if these Arrakis and these vampires are Scorch protected, not Scorch proof, not only are the Crones not Scorch protective, nor are they Scorch proof, but they're like fucking Scorch bait. Okay, when I play these guys down, I'm expecting Chris Hansen to pop up and say Dateline NBC and ask me what I was doing putting my hands on these Scorch bait. Okay, These guys, when you play them, they will attract a Scorch like flies to honey. Dropping these guys down, they are 3 high point value cards, and your opponent loves to Scorch them if they have a card available. It is rare that I just drop these down and get them through a round untouched. The only way to really do that is when you're planning, you've seen Scorch come out already, and you're hoping there are not additional Scorches. But really, not only can a regular Scorch card kill these guys off, but this dragon can kill these guys off, because by throwing them all down at the same time, you've got 18 points in your close combat line, even if you don't have any of these other cards down there. So pay attention to when you throw these guys down. The place where I like to use them the most is when my opponent is in, let's see, round 1 and they've passed because they think they have a dominant win. I will throw these guys down after the pass to kind of steal the win. Or if I pass out of round 1 and go to round 2, you know how the AI likes to play either no cards and force you to play a card, or they like to play a high point value card and then pass to force you to play a card. That's the situation where in the second round I might play these guys as well, because it keeps them from having to eat a Scorch. I mean, if you're going to use this group just to pull a Scorch off the board, you could do that. I mean, I don't want to say it's an invalid use of them, because it's really not. I mean, if you can get a Scorch off the board, hey, any way to do it is good. It saves some potential issues you have when you try to put down your vampires or your Arrakis. However, if you can use them in another way that gets you a win, and they wind up just securing a win without pulling a Scorch off, that's not too bad either. So use them either way. I'm not saying putting them down and pulling a Scorch is a bad thing at all. I'm just saying, in my personal opinion, I would rather not do that sometimes, unless I know that a deck is just constantly running Scorch, or someone is constantly giving me trouble with Scorch. The way I set up my Arrakis and Vampire muster groups, when I put them out there, I generally don't care about Scorch too much. It doesn't really scare me that much. So I don't like to use these guys as Scorch bait if I don't absolutely have to. So just a little bit about the muster groups and how they work. The next thing to talk about is with the muster groups is your initial card draw. So when you do your initial card draw and you have a chance to discard cards, if you were to pull like 2 Crones in your hand and like 2 Arrakis and a Vampire, my recommendation would be to try to discard one of the Crones and one of the Arrakis and pull something else, because with the muster ability, when you play one of these cards, it's automatically going to pull every single card from this muster group out of your hand and out of your deck and put it on the board. So what you don't want to do is have one of your 10 cards in your hand have one of those spots taken up by a duplicate member of a muster group. So you can safely just have one member of each muster group, and when you play them, it's going to pull the cards you need out of your deck. You don't need to have them in your hand. If they're in your hand, it kind of sucks, because it's like having to play 2 cards at once when you really only wanted to play one. So you're almost getting penalized by losing this card, which you technically didn't really play. So instead of playing a card on, one card out of your hand on a turn, you wound up playing 2 cards out of your hand on a turn, and it takes your card count down, and you can get really low in cards very quickly, and you can lose the game if you wound up, drawing like 4 of these Arrakis into your hand and then keeping them, and like 3 Crones, and it doesn't make any sense to hold more than one of each muster group, because when you play it, it's going to take it out of your deck anyways. There's no reason to hold it in your hand. As long as you got one of them, you're good. Don't worry about it. So my strong recommendation is, when you do your redraw phase, redraw out any duplicates that you have from muster groups and see if you can get rid of those bastards, because you don't want to hold them. It's not doing you any good. See if you can draw into some of your better cards, some of your special cards, some of your hero cards, something that would actually be useful, because duplicates in a muster group just don't do you any good. So that's it for the muster groups. Let's go on and talk about our heroes. So when we take those ghouls and our neckers out of our hand, early on we might be replacing them with some neutral cards or some other cards that are in our monster deck that have higher point values but are really just one-off type cards. They don't have any special abilities. They don't fall into our muster groups. However, when you get a little bit later in the game, you're going to want to start stacking heroes in place of those 6 Neckers and Ghouls that you took out. So between the Neckers and the Ghouls, you took 6 cards out. So what you can do is you can add in Geralt, Ciri, and then they're the neutral hero cards. And then you can go down into your monster deck and drop in the Draug, Immelrith, the Leshen, and the Kayrin. And once those are in your deck, those are the 6 replacement cards that you put in when you pull out your Ghouls and your Neckers. So those are the ultimate cards that I feel need to replace those cards when you pull them out, because these have much more utility. They can't be scorched off. They're not going to be vulnerable to that close combat Scorch. And the Kayrin has this wonderful special ability that says it adds +1 to all units in a row, excluding itself. So we talked a little bit earlier about when we were looking at the commanders, when I said there was kind of a situation that could come up if you have the right cards, where if you get Biting Frost on your entire close combat deployment, that it's not necessarily the end of the world. And the reason for that is if you have a Commander's Horn, or you are running the King of the Wild Hunt commander that has the Commander's Horn ability, what you can do is, say you have played all 12 of your muster cards down to your close combat line. So you have 12 points down there. If you add in the Kayrin card, it's going to take the value of all of those cards and add 1 to it. So instead of having 12 points there, you have 24 points there. Okay? Plus the 8 of the Kayrin, but we don't care about the Kayrin at the moment because he's not getting modified by anything. So instead of 12, now you have 24 points. That's not so bad, right? I mean, it sucks to have a Biting Frost sitting on top of those cards because you could have so many more points, but 24 points is nothing to laugh at. So we got 24 points down there. Now, if you were to drop a Commander's Horn down there or call your King of the Wild Hunt ability and drop this Commander's Horn down there, now instead of having 28 or 24 points down there, you got 48 points down there. Now that's a respectable number. It's still, once again, not as good as it could be if that Biting Frost wasn't there, but you know, it's a good way to make make lemonade from lemons. I mean, it sucks that you got that Biting Frost on there, but still, you can pull something out of it, and it can help you eke out a win if you set it up in that way. So that's why I really do like having the Kayrin in the deck, and also that Commander's Horn ability. It lets you adjust your playstyle based on things you may or may not have in your deck to get around some situations that come up that they might be kind of fucking ugly, but you can play your way out of them, so it's nice. So those are the heroes that I like to run. Let's go up and talk about spies, because we are running the Mysterious Elf. So we're going to dump the Mysterious Elf in our deck, and I mentioned before that the spy usage in a monster deck differs from the strategy and thought behind spy usage in the Nilfgaard deck and the Northern Realms deck. If you're playing Nilfgaard or Northern Realms, the general mantra is spy early, spy often. You love spies. You love to get the spies out. You love to decoy the spies off. You love to play them back. You love to pull them out of your discard pile and play them again. As many spies as you can get out is what you want to do, and you want to do it as much as you can throughout the game. There have absolutely been games where I've got myself down to having 0 cards in my deck anymore. I just have them all. I've played them in my they're either in my discard pile or they're in my hand. I've just drawn everything out because there have been so many spies that have passed between myself and my opponent back and forth. That's great if you're Nilfgaard or Northern Realms. That doesn't work out so well if you are a monster deck player. And the reason being is that when you play a spy, it's going to grab 2 cards from your deck and put them in your hand. Normally, that's great. However, in this situation with the monster deck, that may not be as desirable as you think. So this one spy is a great spy because he gets you 2 cards like every other spy, but he's a 0 point value card and he's a hero card. So 0 points means you're not adding anything to your opponent's total, and a hero card means your opponent will never be able to decoy him off and use him himself. and he will never be able to draw him out of his discard pile with a medic ability. So that's great. But when you play this down and you draw 2 cards out of your deck, what do we not want to draw? What we just talked about in the redraw phase of the initial part where you have your 10 cards and you're trying not to do something. You're trying not to have duplicates of your muster groups in your hand. So early on in the game, if you have not played out your musters, if you play a spy, it's highly likely that you will draw additional muster cards into your hand that you already have. That would suck. That would just be a shitty use of a spy. It would be a waste because you do not need additional muster group cards in your hand that you're already holding. Duplicates of muster groups don't do you any good. They just waste spots in your hand because as soon as you play one, the other one's going on the board anyways. So my recommendation with spies is if you get them or you're in a situation to pick them up, do so, but don't use them until later in the game. Maybe round 2. Once if you won round 1, you're on to round 2, and now you're picking up out some spies with decoys or however you're doing it. Or you have this guy in your hand. You've got your musters out. Once your musters are all out of your deck, it's safe to play your spies because you're not going to draw into them anymore. You're going to draw your heroes that you didn't pick up in your initial card draw, or your special cards, or whatever else you're running. Then the spies are a boon. They're great. They're wonderful. And they are just as good as they were when you were playing Northern Realms or Nilfgaard or something along those lines. They're not going to be a detriment to your hand by potentially drawing additional muster cards that you're already holding and wasting their card draw. So make sure that you pay attention when you're using your spies that you've got your musters out, or at least you've got the majority of your musters out. If you still haven't got your Crone muster out, if you're holding one of them and there's 2 of them in your deck with all of your other cards, what are the odds you're going to draw both of them? Probably not high. You may draw one, but you get something else. If you're forced into a situation where you really got to play that spy card and you can't get all your muster groups out, that's okay. But if you have like 1 vampire in your hand and the other 4 are sitting in your deck, and you've got 1 Arrakis in your hand and the other 3 are sitting in your deck, and then you have all your Crones, of 7 cards, there's a pretty high likelihood with the way your card draw is going to go that you're going to be pulling some of these out of your deck and into your hand and wasting that spy. So just don't use your spies if you're holding on to musters, in my opinion. It's a waste. So let's move on to our special cards and talk about the special cards we put in our deck. Now, Dandelion is he's a unit card, but in my opinion, he's a special card that doesn't show up under the special card count. Because Dandelion is special. If you've met him, you know that. But no, seriously. I like to run him in my deck because he is a close combat commander's horn. He is identical to the ability that your leader has, except he's got 2 points, and he's a card that can be put on the board. And he's a low point value card, so him getting scorched off, not that likely. So putting him down, it's nice. I like to have him in my deck because it gives me the ability to question just how many Commander's Horns I run. If I'm running Dandelion in my deck, it's entirely likely that I'm only running 1 Commander's Horn. Because I've got my ability on my commander himself, then I have Dandelion, which is going to go on the close combat line, which is where the majority of my musters go, right? So there's no reason to care that he doesn't play on any other line. He only plays on close combat. For the monster deck, that's fucking perfect. That's exactly what we want. Okay, so and then we've got our Commander's Horn. So we've got 3 potentially, 1 guaranteed that we can pull anytime, and then 2 that we could potentially draw into. If you want to add some more in, go for it. No big deal. I'm just saying that I typically don't run more than 1 when I've got Dandelion floating around. The other card that is not a special card, it's a unit card, I know, but I consider it really special because it has the close combat Scorch ability. This card, I run this card all the time. I love this card. So it's a utility card. It may be a bit of a novelty card, But when I draw it, I love to use it because if somebody is really stacking hard against me, I can really give them a bad day, especially if I'm playing against a monster deck. What did I tell you about playing against a monster deck? When they go really hard after you in that close combat line, or when you go really hard in the close combat line, you wind up getting a biting frost put on you, then this thing comes down and wipes out your whole line. Hey, if you're playing against another monster deck, you can do that to them. Throw some biting frosts in, throw this guy in, and try to draw into him. As a matter of fact, if you don't draw into him and you've got your elf, hey, get your musters out and then get your elf down and see if you can get him. Maybe you try to run a different commander when you're playing against the monster deck. Maybe you decide, hey, I'm actually going to play this. Restore, where's this one? Yeah, discard 2 cards and draw a card of your choice from your deck. If it's that important to you, hey, maybe you load up your deck with some random cards you don't care about and hope you draw into them. If that's going to be your strategy to beat another monster deck, there's no reason to adopt that. As I said with those cards initially, these are very situational. I mean, there's a reason you use them, and it's not because you love them and they're the best leaders in the deck. They have very special abilities with very special implementations on them. They're not for use all the time, in my opinion. So that's one situation where you could technically set your deck up to build around this if you're going against a monster deck, and that's how you wanted to roll. I ain't mad at you. I'm not going to tell you that's the wrong way to play. That's completely valid. So back onto our special cards. The last card that I'll consider special before we get to the real special cards is Yennefer of Vengerberg. So Yen's a medic, and I don't run her all the time. I run her situationally, and the situations in which I run her are I'm going against a Nilfgaard deck or a Northern Realms deck in which they run spies out the ass. If I'm getting spied all the time and I just cannot come up with the decoys to pull the spies off and put them back and then deal with the fact that they're going to medic them out and put them back on me again, I may let some spies go to my discard pile and then use Yennefer to get them out of my discard. However, keep in mind again, you don't want to pull that spy out if you're holding a bunch of your muster cards still in your hand. You want to make sure they have been played on the board in a previous round or the current round, because once you play her, it's going to automatically take that spy if you choose to grab the spy out of your discard pile and put it on the board. You're not going to have a choice to put it in your hand. It goes right to the board. So what you don't want to do is have it go right to the board and then you draw more of the muster groups you're already holding, and you're like, shit, I screwed that up. So don't do that. That's just a bad usage of her. But she can be used in that situation to retrieve a spy if you're running out of decoys or you're struggling with card draw against some of the Nilfgaard or Northern Realms decks that run a lot of spies. So on to real special cards. So we talked about the Commander's Horn. I definitely like to run one if I'm running Dandelion. Scorch. I love me some Scorch. I love me some Scorch. I love me some Scorch. So I love it 3 times. That's why I run all 3 cards. Scorch is fantastic as a monster deck. It is, you run such low point value cards outside of the Crones. Even with them, I mean, they're 6s. You've got your Nilfgaard deck that has a number of 10-point cards that commonly go on the board. And when you've got 1, 2, or all 3 of their 10-point cards on the board that are just regular unit cards, you whip a Scorch out on them, that hurts. So that is a great way to play that card. Or if you're going against the Northern Realm guys, they've got those Blue Stripes Commandos that when they group up, they go from 4 points to 8 points, 8 points to 16 points when all 3 of them are on the board. If that happens, that's a significant number of points that wind up being on the board. And if they're a 16-point value, you don't have anything close to a 16-point value in your deck. So scorch the shit out of those guys. Same thing on the Northern Realms deck with the Reaver's Dragon Hunters. Those guys go from 5-point value cards to 10-point value cards to, I think, 20-point value cards. So once again, scorch the shit out of... No, actually, they go to 15. They go to 15. So, and then if they dump, like, Commander's Horn on them, and if they got 3 of them down there, they're each worth 15 points. That's 45 points. If Commander's Horn goes on there, that's 90 points. Those things can get nasty real quick. Just scorch the shit out of those little bitches. Get them off the board. Give that Northern Realms deck player a bad day. So I love me some Scorch. They are great. The other cards I would absolutely run is Clear Weather. You can see I only have two. I screwed up when I got my achievement and got my achievement a little early and couldn't get my final Clear Weather card. But whether you have one, two, three, regardless, run it. Run it, run it, run it. This is great because it protects you from the biting frost coming down and giving you a bad day. So if you don't draw it, that's fine. I mean, play around that stuff, but definitely run it in your deck because you're hoping to get at least one of these. Now, if you're running the other commander, that is the Clear Weather commander, it's no big deal to only run one of these in your deck because you can only use your commander's ability one time anyways. So if you're saying, hey, you know what, I'm not going to carry one in my hand, I'm only ever going to use this if I can use my commander's ability, and then fuck it, only run one of them, and you're good to go, right? No reason to carry more than one, in my opinion. You can run more than one if you want. I just figure if you're going to only use that commander's ability to pull this out, then there's no reason to run others because you're not going to hold one in your hand. You're probably going to use that spot in your hand for another card if you can manage it. So if you're in that situation and, there's no reason not to run some additional weather cards. As I said, if you're going against the monster deck, maybe you run some Biting Frost. Just make sure you don't Biting Frost yourself. You can give yourself a bad day accidentally, so don't do that. Impenetrable Fog. If you're playing against somebody who's constantly rocking out that range line, there's no reason to not have some of these in your deck. Same thing with Torrential Rain, especially if you're going up against the not the Nilfgaard. Fuck me. If you're going against the Northern Realms deck, I think I have a shit ton of siege cards. So definitely, if they're playing a lot of them on you and you're having trouble doing something about it, you can't get, you're not drawing into Scorch all the time or something along those lines, throw a Torrential Rain or two in your deck and use those to change the course of the game by just reducing the value of all those cards down to 1 in that back row and not worrying about it. So this is definitely a deck that you can add some weather to, and it's really not going to be that detrimental to how the deck is played, in my opinion. So definitely feel free to throw some weather in as you see fit. This is the deck where you probably are going to play a game with someone and lose in order to figure out what cards they play so that you can come back and customize your deck to go back and then just stomp them. This is definitely a deck that you can customize to stomp an opponent once you understand how that opponent is playing and what cards they generally run in their deck. It is absolutely a deck you can just go in and stomp them on the first round if you have it set up right, but some things can happen that throw it off. You can get some really bad card draw, or your opponent can get some really good card draw and give you trouble. But it is definitely a deck I feel that can be customized to beat any opponent. Just based on knowing what their deck is and how to play against it effectively. So I really like the monster deck for that specific reason. Alright, last but not least, let's talk about adding another card to our deck, maybe two, in order to get us up to the 22 required points in the number of unit cards you must run to have a complete deck. So if you really wanted to, you could just dump Triss in and call it a day. She's a 7-point hero card. She can't be Scorched. She's worth 7 points. Not a bad decision. The other cards that you might want to drop in are... We're saving those for last if you caught the decoys up there. We're going to talk about them. The next cards here that you may want to run are these elemental cards, right? So you may want to run those instead of Triss. We're putting all three of them in here just for comparison at the moment. So the reason I personally like these cards is because, unlike Triss, if I play one of these cards down, it still has a potential to move through to the next round with my faction perk. So the faction perk from your Scoia'tael deck is that you always go first. The faction perk from your Nilfgaardian deck is that if you go to a draw in any round, you win. And the faction perk for Northern Realms is they draw a card at the beginning of the round. And the faction perk for the monster deck is one of your monster unit cards will stay on the playing surface in the row that it was played in, whether that be close combat, ranged, or siege, in between rounds, and it randomly selects a card. So notice that I said monster unit card, not hero card. So she's not a monster card at all, so she would never go through to the next round. But even your monster cards that are they look like unit cards, but they're not. I mean, they're hero cards, right? So this Leshen, if you dropped it on the board and we're like, haha, fucker, this thing's going to the next round with me. Deal with that, bitch. And then you go to the next round and you're like, oh shit, now I feel like a dumbass because that just went in my discard pile. Yeah, this is not a unit card. This is a hero card. So make sure that you understand the difference between that and a regular unit card, so you don't make that mistake and think you're going to win, and then you wind up feeling kind of dumb and wind up losing because of it. So that's why I like to run these guys instead of Triss, because they are a card that is a high point value. It plays on a line other than the close combat line, so it does give me an additional line to buff if I really wanted to. They could line up fairly well with the Arrakis Behemoth, since it goes in the siege line. It gives you two or three 6-point value cards that if you had to and you had a spare Commander's Horn available, you could buff them up to 12, 24, 36 points, depending on how many you had. It wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to have those cards, whereas with Triss, you couldn't buff her anyways because she's a hero card. So that's why I don't like to run her, and I do like to run them instead. And in fact, I wind up running both of them and not just one of them to get the card minimum. I like to run both of them to increase my chance of potentially drawing one of them, because I do like to have them for that very purpose. That is completely a personal play style. That's not something I've seen anybody else do. It's not something I've heard anybody comment on. It's something that I just, pulled out of my ass early on in my monster deck days and thought, this is kind of useful and have run them like that ever since. So that's how I set those up, and I promised we'd get back to decoys. Decoys are special cards. You can pick up to 3 of them, and I recommend that you don't run them in your deck unless... You knew there was going to be an unless there. Come on. Unless you're playing against a Nilfgaard deck, or you're playing against a Northern Realms deck that is spy heavy. So if it's a spy heavy deck, I absolutely recommend that you run the decoys and run all of the decoys. Get all of them into your hand, or all of them into your deck, and pray that you can get all of them into your hand, especially if it is a spy heavy deck that you're playing against, because when a spy goes down, you can decoy it off. When you play it back and then it goes into their discard pile, or they decoy it off and play it back on you, you can then decoy it off again, or if they medic it out of their discard pile, you can decoy it off again. There's all kinds of situations in which having one of those decoys available in order to get a spy off the board into your hand and ready to play at some point later in the game, remember, that's great. So I definitely run them, but only when I'm playing against decks that I know are spy heavy. I don't run them as my default cards. If I do run against a Nilfgaard deck or a Northern Realms deck, I assume they're running spies. That is not always the case. I have gone against some very spy light or spy missing in action decks where there was not a single spy that came out the whole time. That may have been bad card draw on the AI's point, or it may have just been a really sucky deck. But in general, if it's Northern Realms or it's Nilfgaard, they're running spies, and they have the capability to run a shit ton of them. So keep an eye out for that stuff. Don't get caught slipping with the Nilfgaard or the Northern Realms deck and not have any decoys, because they can increase their card draw significantly against you by dropping spies on you, and it can really put you at a significant disadvantage. So just keep that in mind. That's just my opinion on those, but that's about it. We talked about Yennefer. We talked about our decoys. We talked a little bit about weather and Commander's Horns. If you want to dump another one in here, notice you do have room to put, another Commander's Horn in here. You really need to take this deck and play it and see what your draws wind up coming up to be. If you get yourself in a situation where you've played 5 or 6 matches and you come back and you're like, damn, MC was a fucking retard. He doesn't know what he's talking about. I have never drawn that Commander's Horn. I have never seen Dandelion come out. You know, I need to run 2 Commander's Horns. I need to run 3 Commander's Horns. Oh, do it. You've got the room to do it. Throw them in there, and it'll increase your chances of drawing them. It's just in my experience, I have not run into situations where I'm like, damn, I didn't get that Dandelion, I didn't get that Commander's Horn, it just ruined my game. That hasn't happened. You know, the deck is built to play around various situations. It's nice to have them, but you know what? You always have your leader ability. So you don't absolutely need them to come up in the draw. So that's why I only run 1. But if you want to run more, hell, run more. You got room for them. You got 4 more spots just based on this build to put extra cards in there. Put your weather in there. Put a couple more Commander's Horns. You know, whatever you want to do. This is a highly customizable deck. Remember what I said. Highly customizable. You can change it to play any way you want. It really is one of the more advanced decks, in my opinion, because there are so many chances to play it so well, and there are so many chances to play it so poorly and just lose and be like, oh, this deck sucks, this is a shitty deck. I'm not, well, yeah, sometimes it's, the problem isn't with the deck. Sometimes a problem occurs between the chairback and the keyboard. I'll let that sink in for a sec. That's it, guys. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section. If you need help with anything, you know I am always here to help out if I can. Please leave your questions down there in the comments. And please, if you enjoyed the video or you got anything out of it, I'd appreciate it if you'd like the video. And if you're enjoying the content on the channel, please subscribe. If you're having any questions about the Gwent stuff in the game, if you check out the video description below, you will see just a ton of links to various Gwent content from Witcher 3. I've got links to all the Gwent quests. I've got links to all the secondary quests that yield Gwent cards, links to a Gwent tutorial, overview of your Gwent decks. Right now, as of the recording of this video, there's only for the Northern Realms deck, but more will be coming. There's also links to videos that show you where you can go to purchase all of the Gwent cards that you can buy in the game, as well as locations of all of the random merchants in the game that will play you games of Gwent for random card rewards. And that dragon that I was showing you that is that 7-point card, this one right here that we were talking about, this is a random reward from playing merchants. So there's no way to guarantee you're going to get this card other than going out and just playing mad numbers of Gwent games with random merchants and praying that RNGesus loves you and blesses you and gives you this card early. RNGesus hates me and cursed me, and I got this 1 card. Yeah, 1 card or 2 cards right before I got my achievement. So I played a lot of games of Gwent before I got this, and I really wanted it early on. The first time I saw it, I was like, damn, that card's nice, I want that, and then I just didn't get it until the very end, which sucked. So I wish you the best of luck in getting it. Hopefully you have better luck than I did, but that's it. So, as always, thanks for watching. Take care.